Rain streaked the front windows of the cafe, each drop trailing down the glass like a slow-moving tear. Outside, the highway shone slick and black under the steady downpour, headlights from passing cars flashing briefly before disappearing into the gray. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the mingled aromas of frying bacon, fresh coffee, and the faint sweetness of pie cooling on a back counter. Plates clattered. Forks scraped porcelain. A low hum of conversation moved through the room like a background song everyone knew by heart. Sam Hayes, stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a tired jingle. He paused to knock the rain from his shoulders, his coat old but clean, the wool holding the scent of damp air and time. A subtle limp marked his walk as he crossed the scuffed linoleum floor, boots whispering against it with the sound of worn leather. The limp wasn't the kind that begged sympathy, it was the kind you got from years of marching over ground most people never saw, the kind you learned to live with. He found the counter, resting his hand on the worn edge. The waitress behind the coffee pot gave him a small nod, but before she could speak, a young man in a pressed polo and a name tag reading, "Manager," appeared. Sam reached for his wallet, sliding out his veteran's ID, with the quiet pride of someone who didn't need to announce it. "Coffee. Bacon and eggs if you've got 'em," he said. The manager's eyes dropped to the card, and a smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. "Military discounts for active duty only," he said, the words clipped and dismissive. Sam's voice was steady, almost gentle. "I'm not asking for the discount. Just the meal." The smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "We've had incidents before. Old guys thinking they can come in, flash an ID and stir things up. Policy says I can refuse service." "So I am." He said it loud enough for the sound to ripple outward, brushing against the edges of other conversations. Some of the travelers hunched over their plates looked up, forks paused halfway to their mouths. A woman by the window glanced between the two men, her brow tightening. Most, though, shifted their eyes away, pretending not to notice, letting the uncomfortable moment pass without their involvement. Sam stayed where he was, shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The only sign of tension was the way his thumb pressed against the edge of his cap, the fabric creasing under the steady pressure. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shiver through the glass. The manager stepped back, folding his arms like the matter was settled. "Policy," he repeated, the word sharp and final. Sam's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then back to the counter. He said nothing. Years in uniform had taught him that sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. Still, the refusal settled in his chest with a heavy, familiar weight, the kind that came from realizing not every battle was fought with weapons, and not every wound bled. He didn't move yet, not because he wanted to stay, but because he was deciding which would cost him more, walking away or standing his ground. Sam shifted his weight, turning toward the door, the bell above it swaying faintly from when he had first walked in. His boots made a muted scrape against the linoleum, the sound nearly lost beneath the low rumble of conversation and the hiss of rain on the roof. He had taken only 2 steps when a voice drifted from the corner booth. "Guess some old soldiers think a uniform gets 'em free breakfast," one of the men said, the tone laced with a lazy kind of cruelty. It wasn't loud at first, but it was pitched just high enough to make sure it reached him. Another voice followed, deeper and edged with a laugh. "Careful. He might tell you one of those war stories no one wants to hear, might take all morning." A chuckle slipped out, and the sound prickled against the quiet in Sam's mind. He kept walking, eyes fixed on the door, but his ears caught the shuffling from their booth, the scrape of chair legs on the floor. The first voice came again, louder this time, emboldened by the fact that the manager hadn't said a word. "Hey, don't trip over that limp, Grandpa." Out of the corner of his vision, Sam saw the taller one tilt his head toward his friend, then hitch his shoulder and drag one foot in an exaggerated imitation of Sam's walk. The other slapped the table, grinning at the performance. Their laughter had a sharp, tinny edge to it, too high for humor, too low for innocence. A couple at the next table glanced over, eyes darting between the mockers and Sam, then quickly dropped back to their plates. The waitress at the coffee pot froze for half a second, then busied herself wiping a spotless counter. No one stepped in. No one told them to stop. Sam's grip on his cap tightened, the soft fabric bending under his fingers. He didn't turn around. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his face. Years in the service had taught him the value of patience, of knowing when to speak, and when silence could be its own kind of shield. He had stood under enemy fire without flinching. He could stand under this. But the sting was there, deep and slow, like the ache in an old wound when the weather turned. He let the words pass over him, but they didn't vanish. They lodged in quiet places where memory lived. Places that remembered nights colder than this rain, and mornings that came with orders that changed lives. The cafe lights buzzed faintly overhead, their glow harsher now, bleaching the warmth from the room. Outside, the rain's rhythm shifted, growing heavier, the drops slapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, low and deliberate, as if the sky itself was warning of something coming. Sam adjusted the collar of his coat, steadying himself before taking another step toward the door, leaving the mocking voices to echo in the cramped space behind him. The laughter from the corner booth was still lingering in the air when another sound began to thread its way into the cafe, a low, resonant growl that didn't belong to the storm. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the highway beyond the rain. But it grew steadily, deepening into a deliberate rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Conversations faltered. Forks paused mid-air. Heads began to turn toward the windows. Outside, the steady downpour turned the glass into a blurred canvas, but shapes emerged through the streaks. Dark, hulking silhouettes rolled into view, SUVs in tight formation, their matte paint slick with rain, windshield wipers sweeping in perfect rhythm. The sound of the engine settled into an idyll that somehow felt louder than the chatter inside. Whoever they hadn't come by accident. The vehicles halted directly in front of the cafe. A heartbeat later, the door swung open. A gust of cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. The bell above the door gave a sharp jingle, but the sound was swallowed by the sudden shift in atmosphere. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence cutting through the room like a blade through fabric. His general's dress uniform was immaculate midnight blue coat, perfectly tailored, rows of ribbons and medals aligned with precision, polished brass buttons gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The starched collar framed a face carved by time and command, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Flanking him were two aides in service uniforms, moving with the crisp efficiency of men who knew their place and their orders. They closed the door behind him, sealing out the rain but not the charged energy that had swept in with him. The general's eyes began to move slowly across the cafe. It wasn't the idle glance of a curious stranger, it was the deliberate scan of a man trained to take in a room in a single sweep, cataloging every face, every detail. A few patrons straightened instinctively, backs a little straighter, shoulders squared, as though an invisible inspection was underway. Even the manager, who had been leaning against the counter with a self-satisfied air moments ago, adjusted his stance without realizing it. Then the general's gaze landed on Sam. It wasn't just a look, it was recognition. A flicker, brief but unmistakable, passed across his expression. Without a word, he began to move, his stride steady and unhurried but full of purpose. The aides fell in behind him, their boots clicking softly against the floor. The corner booth fell silent, the smirks faded. All eyes followed the general as he crossed the room, the space between him and Sam closing with every deliberate step. The air seemed to tighten, the storm outside reduced to a distant whisper compared to the weight of his approach. Sam hadn't moved, but his hand eased its grip on his cap just slightly. Whatever was about to happen, he could feel the shift coming, like the moment before a salute is returned, or the quiet before a command changes everything. The general stopped in front of Sam, the room holding its breath as if the air itself knew something important was about to be said. He removed his hat with deliberate care, tucking it neatly under his arm before extending his hand. His voice carried easily, not raised, but steady and rich with meaning. "It's been too long, Sergeant Hayes. The nation still owes you more than it can repay." The words settled over the cafe like a heavy, undeniable truth. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates, forgotten. All eyes fixed on the two men standing in the sharp lines of a dress uniform, the other seated in an old coat, boots worn thin by decades of life and service. Sam rose slowly, accepting the general's hand. His grip was firm, not from any effort to prove strength, but from the kind of handshake forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. A flicker of surprise touched his weathered features, but it quickly gave way to something quieter recognition, and perhaps a touch of relief. The general turned his head toward the counter, eyes locking on the young manager. His tone remained courteous, but there was an iron edge beneath the calm, the kind that left no doubt the words were not up for debate. "I understand my friend was denied service here," he said. "That changes now." The statement was simple, but it carried a weight that filled every corner of the cafe. The manager's face drained of color. His mouth opened, words fumbling out in half-formed excuse policy, misunderstanding, timing, but none of it landed. The general didn't bother to argue. He simply glanced at one of his aides and gave a quiet, precise instruction. 2 menus were retrieved, orders were taken. The general requested a full meal for Sam and himself, nothing more, nothing less. The matter was settled without raised voices or threats, the authority in his presence making any resistance impossible. They sat at a booth near the window, the general across from Sam. Rain still traced slow, glistening lines down the glass, but the sound of it had softened, the storm losing its edge. As they waited for the food, the general leaned back slightly, studying the man in front of him. Then, for the benefit of the room and, perhaps for the 2 young men still sitting stiffly in the corner, he began to speak. He told of a night years ago, deep in hostile territory, when a mission had gone sideways. Supplies were scarce, comms unreliable, and the unit trapped under enemy watch. It was Sam Hayes, the general said, who had volunteered to slip through the darkness, navigating terrain no one else knew, bringing back the intelligence and support that turned near-certain disaster into survival. He told it plainly, without embellishment, but with a quiet reverence that made the story heavier than any shouted praise. The corner booth stayed silent. The smirks were gone. The 2 young men kept their eyes fixed anywhere but on the older soldier or the general. Around the cafe, people shifted in their seats, the weight of what they were hearing pulling them into stillness. The waitress arrived with 2 steaming plates, setting them down gently, as though even the clink of dishes might disturb the moment. Sam murmured his thanks, his voice low but steady. The general gave a small nod before lifting his fork, the conversation between them now dropping into the private, easy rhythm of old comrades. Outside, the rain thinned into a soft drizzle, light catching in the puddles along the road. Inside, the air felt different, lighter, but marked with something lasting. The earlier tension had been replaced by an unspoken reminder: respect, once earned, is not optional, it is owed, and it is remembered. Sam didn't look toward the corner booth as he ate, but he didn't need to. The point had been made without him saying a word.